So I'm Alyssa, this is Quincy, this is Aubrey, this is Thomas, special guest. And this is our second video on film and costume and how gender interacts with that. And this specifically is going to be about science fiction movies. In the book Hollywood and History, it says, when recreating costumes of the past, designers have historical precedents to turn to, but what do designers do when looking to the future? The costumes they create must reflect the social structure and values of the new society. Dress must complement the vision of the future being produced by the movie makers.
Meet the most beautiful creature of the future. Her name is Barbarella.
Basically, Barbarella she's a female astronaut that is sent from Earth to retrieve a scientist and basically crash lands on this planet and then sleeps her way through the universe and gets in sticky situations. It's a crazy kind of movie. It's
very campy.
Very campy, yes. And the writer of it was, he was a French writer. He was Jean-Claude Forest, and the artist of the original comic was Daniel Billard. Yeah, so this movie was just based off of those comics. So the film was directed by Roger Vadim. Actress who played Barbarella was Jane Fonda, and at the time, they were actually married. And it's a really interesting conversation where they are starting to say that this actually is a movie that engages in feminism, and it's actually a feminist movie. Where for the time is interesting, where it's kind of controversial because have you guys seen the very first opening scene?
Yeah.
It's a striptease of her just unstripping and all the stripping down into absolutely nothing. And so it kind of goes off to mention that it's okay, well, how is this a feminist kind of film if this woman is just here stripping down? It does talk about how it's the sex and empowerment and desire, which from the 1950s and 60s, it's a very huge different discussion where women aren't supposed to enjoy sex and they're not supposed to desire it as much, whereas this movie kind of is Barbarella wanting that in the movie.
The costumes were designed by Jacques Fonterey, but they're frequently credited to Paco Rabanne. Well, not entirely. It's just if you look it up, a lot of the times it'll be he worked on this film. I don't think he actually worked on the film. A lot of the costumes that Barbarella wears are very clearly inspired by Paco Rabanne's designs, especially the green costume. So he's a very, very obvious influence, and everyone could tell that. But I don't think he actually worked on the film. I'm pretty sure Jacques Fonterey designed all of these costumes himself, just using other space retro futuristic looking designs for inspiration.
He was a classic and futuristic blend just in the fashion world in general, and the designer of this film especially wanted to include that. And it's a lot of these space age fashion. It was the space age movement of the 1960s fashion movement, and it was a really interesting time because it was more alternative and experimental fabrics. It was more about the way that they looked rather than the actual convention. But it's something that is very artistic and something that it looks really good. And it dominated in Paris during that time. But it took a while to actually come over to America and the US because it was less traditional, kind of style.
It's very cool. He used it looked like he used metal and chainmail and stuff a lot, just not fabric materials, which is really cool.
It's really cool too because the space age fashion you'll find, they're much more in the minimalism and with clean lines and structured silhouettes, and that's there they even get into the psychedelics too of the 70s as well. But it was they really much embraced the innovation as well as the futuristic vision that really kind of came into play with that, and it broke the fashion world in that sense. Jane Fonda at the time was a sex symbol and a popular feminist of that time period too, and so it was really interesting to see the costumes that they put her in because she's seen in chainmail, she's seen in discs, plastics, furs at one point, and there's one part where she is flying, she's in a white bodysuit And then she is wearing chainmail, and then it has red lines that kind of contour like the female figure in that sense. It's also there as like an artistic movement rather than like showing that she's completely nude, or it's referencing to some areas that would indicate that.
It's interesting how they sort of try to balance, like, it's feminist, she's doing what she wants. And it's also like still completely male gaze, because
ultimately
because everything she wears is incredibly sexy. It's all like, as I think I read that the opening scene was like to get men to stay to watch the movie, because they might come in and be like, I don't want to watch a movie about a female astronaut, but if she's completely naked, then they might be willing to.
And wearing costumes too, where they said the bodysuits especially would rip easier. And so it was like that way when those costumes were worn, she was showing skin. Like she was practically nude the whole time.
Yeah.
Nowadays it's kind of more read as the feminist, like a feminist kind of movie, is because there's the pill from Earth that's important to mention. That that's how they had like sexual pleasure, I guess they could say. Like they never actually did the physical act. And so when she was introduced to it, when she first is rescued from the very burly man.
If there's anything you need or that I can do, please tell me.
Well, you could let me make love to you.
But it was interesting because as time went on, she became less and less interested with the pill, and she enjoyed sex more and does it for her own personal pleasure, which is interesting because that wasn't something that was really common back then.
It is still benefiting not only the men in the movie every time she does it, but also the men who are watching the movie, getting to see her.
And then it's like, even then, she's like barely wearing any clothing when most of the guys in there are like usually clothed and not...
the guys are like much more clothed generally. Like they're still wearing some very
really
interesting costumes, but like the guys are much more clothed.
It reminds me of Modesty Blaze a lot in the way that it's like, it's not really like a solid story, it's more like visuals. And they both have like female protagonists that are like doing an unconventional job, I guess. Like Modesty Blaze is a spy, Barbarella's, I guess, an astronaut. It's like kind of a weird juxtaposition of being like, here's how women can engage with these typically male genres, but they still have to be like supermodel actresses. I feel like it's like it was like a needed step in like women in other genres being included, but it was like not quite there.
It was like a step forward and 2 steps back, maybe. Like kind of mindset.
Going along with like the more insidious undertones that the movie has. It's very fun, it's very campy, it's very pretty, but it also is inherently for the male gaze. And it goes along with the trope of like the born sexy yesterday trope. I think Barbarella definitely falls into that. She's not like incompetent, but she's
incapable.
She's incapable, and she's in these places and these like alien worlds where she doesn't know what's going on, and so these men are able to take advantage of her, and that's what makes her appealing to men who are watching it.
The need to be rescued.
Yeah.
Like every single scene that she enters, she like immediately passes out or gets captured.
The first
to be rescued.
The first
vampire children.
Yeah, no, the first fight that she's in is with a bunch of children and their dolls, and she loses it immediately.
A lonely ship streaks along an endless path. It's the mammoth starship Enterprise. Follow her trackless journey each week on Star Trek.
Star Trek was first aired in 1966, although it wasn't super popular when it first aired. It became popular in the 70s. The show was created by Gene Roddenberry, who had written on westerns before. He had written like westerns for television, and when he first like was coming up with the idea for Star Trek, he called it a wagon train to the stars. So it's in space, but it's also very Western. Like, it's like a cowboy movie almost. Women are largely secondary in all of the roles. Like, there are main characters that are women. You have Uhura and you have Nurse Chapel, and early on you have Janice. But they all like are clearly secondary to Kirk and Spock and to all the other men. The entirety of Star Trek, like I mentioned, can be read as like an American Western like cowboy story. It even has the idea of manifest destiny in it. It had like the entire point of the show is that they're on an imperialistic mission to colonize space. That's what they say at the beginning of every episode. However, the show is also remembered for its more progressive ideas for the other shows of that time, especially for sci-fi. As Patricia Vettel-Becker in her essay Space and the Single Girl Star Trek Aesthetics and 1960s Femininity says, much has been made about Gene Roddenberry's liberal humanist vision, his belief that in the future humanity will have overcome the racial and ideological prejudices that characterized his present. And we see a lot of interesting characters because of this in this show. Yeah, so the show has like a surprisingly optimistic view for the future. Like it's very colorful and bright, and it's like space is scary, but Star Trek makes it seem like welcoming and interesting. But it does still have like gender structures, like the gender structures of the 1960s. And in the films of Star Trek that starting with Star Trek the Motion Picture, which came out in 1979, it like completely shifts. The bright colors of the original series are gone, and in its place are very like neutral, muted colors for the most part. So the costumes for the first 4 Star Trek movies were designed by Robert Fletcher. I think it's interesting that the first Star Trek movie, 1979, to me, it looks visually, the color palette is so similar to Star Wars, which came out 2 years earlier. So, I mean, like, obviously they must have taken inspiration from that. The basic uniform was apparently the most difficult to design because it had to reference the original costumes but still, like, be completely different. It had to look like the future but not be, like, too crazy out there because that's not what they wanted anymore. And then after the first movie, the costumes change again, and they sort of stay consistent for the rest of these films throughout the 80s. These costumes are inspired by 20th century military uniforms. For the original series, they made an effort to hide zippers or like hooks or like clasps or anything because they didn't feel like that was futuristic enough. But in The Wrath of Khan, we can see that their uniforms have like little like clips and stuff. So
it's interesting that you say that too, because especially in Dune, that's how the costume designers were like saying, I didn't want to include clips or buttons or zippers in the costumes because it did seem like in the future that's not going to be used. And so it's just more solid lines, which is a really interesting aspect that like when it comes to the future, people in costuming especially are like, we're going to be so advanced, zippers aren't even going to matter. Yeah. It's like, kind of crazy.
Like Alien and Blade Runner are kind of the opposite. Like they go for like
they have
very
this like
industrial.
Yeah. The militaristic influences are interesting though, because Roddenberry had always felt that the Federation wasn't supposed to be a military organization, but Robert Fletcher, the costume designer, was like, but they act like they are. So the 60s, they're like they're not supposed to be military. They look friendly, welcoming. And in the 80s, the 70s and the 80s now, it's like, but they are a military and they're going to act like a military and they're going to look like a military. And again, it just shows like the changing ideas of the world. It just has like, it's a less optimistic view for the future, honestly. The women wear pants now.
That
they
makes
have
sense, because like 80s was like power suit.
Suit.
It reminds me of like 40s utility fashion.
And that actually the 80s did reference a lot of their inspiration from the 40s and the utility and the power suit and everything.
The shape,
the shoulders. Always the shoulders with the 80s.
Yeah. So yeah, it's just interesting that now it's like they're less focused on like creating these visually appealing female characters because they're like, no, it's space. They gotta wear spacesuits. Unlike the earlier show, they were known for wearing mini skirts.
Good morning, Captain.
Good morning, Captain.
A woman?
Crewman.
Which at the time they were seen as like liberating, like a symbol of the feminist movement. But to us now they appear more objectifying. And I think that both of those can be true. So William Thies was the costume designer for the original series. He mentioned that originally when they were going to create the show, they had women wear pants. They had almost the exact same uniform for the men and the women. The women in the original series from the 60s, they, unlike the later movies, had to look feminine. They had to fulfill this idea. They had careers, and they weren't very interested in dating. And so they were like... they could be considered threatening to men. And so they had to like even that out by being like, but they're so pretty. They wear skirts. Despite the sort of seemingly limiting nature of the show, women loved Star Trek. Vettel-Becker says, we found them elegant and beautiful. We envied them their positions on the Starship Enterprise, for they were explorers and adventurers and appeared free from the mundane and monotonous tasks of womanhood that my housewife mother faced each day and that I feared I may soon face as well.
I feel like you definitely are seeing more woman influence in the costuming when it comes to the 60s and 70s, because it is more of like the second wave of feminism that comes out. And it's really interesting to see more of a woman's voice and role rather being shown through their costuming, or even like in just in ideas in general.
Thies, the costume designer, he sort of wanted all of his costumes, he tried to make like revealing, which caused some problems because there were censors at NBC. They were like, well, you can't show this on screen. Like very specific what you can't show on screen. But he came up with Thies titillation theory is what it's called. And it's the degree to which a costume is considered sexy is directly proportional to how likely it seems to fall off. Which we can also see in Barbarella. So he creates these costumes that like look like they're going to fall off of these women's bodies, and he's like, this is what makes them appealing.
It's kind of like the aspect of like it's brushing that line again of it being modest but immodest, and like the idea of like this dress coming off, where's the sex appeal. And so it's really interesting to see how that's a actual mantra that they use, like the clothing falling off.
It also kind of applies to Kirk. He loses his shirt in like half of the episodes.
I think it's like really interesting to see how it's like from that perspective of a woman's perspective, where it's not for the intention of putting it into the male audience's minds, but rather just the actual design,
visual beauty, aesthetic. This dress is his favorite. It's from Who Mourns for Adonis.
I am Apollo. I've chosen you.
Well, I'm sure that's very flattering, but I must get on with my work now.
Your work?
I'm a scientist.
In Star Trek, the major motion picture and onwards, we can see that they've dropped this idea. They're no longer like, we have to make all these women so physically appealing and their clothes look like they're gonna fall off. They dress appropriately for how scary space is, and now the uniforms are gender neutral. However, a lot of the women characters are still very secondary. They still, in reality, fulfill pretty much the same role that they did before. The only difference is that visually they have like the same costume as the men now. And the Vulcans are interesting because they have a lot of fantasy and historical inspirations for their clothes. They also have a lot of inspirations from like foreign cultures, so I think they have a lot of Eastern Asian influences. They're like alien, they're supposed to be different, so visually they draw on foreign influences to make them look different. I really like this specific outfit that he wears, the Vulcan robe, because underneath it he's wearing his Starfleet uniform, the little 80s turtleneck, and so it's like sort of just like a visual reminder that he's not just Vulcan and just human. He's from both worlds, and it contrasts with the motion picture when we first see him again back on the Enterprise, and he's like just wearing Vulcan clothes. So it's like a sort of progression.
Somewhere in space, this may all be happening right now. 20th Century Fox and George Lucas now bring you an adventure unlike anything on your planet. Star Wars.
So the world of Star Wars is very different from Star Trek. Instead of following a group of like professionals that are exploring space, they're basically a military. Our protagonists are a group of rebels fighting against an authoritarian government. And many of its aesthetics are similarly Western, like Star Trek, but it's like more rough around the edges. Like
they also have a lot of inspiration from like Japanese and like samurai films. I mean, the costumes, but also like sword fighting turned into lightsaber fighting. And then one that I thought was interesting was that the like shape and design of Darth Vader's costume, it like is kind of similar to like formal armor of a samurai.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things about Star Wars and its costumes is that it draws from so many different cultures. Like, a lot of them are Western. Han Solo is very cowboy. And even, like, Luke has sort of a... He's a farm boy. But Padme, all of her costumes are, like, from cultures around the world.
Like so many
Yeah, and Princess Leia's, like, even her space buns, a likely inspiration for it was Hopi hairstyles and, like, Mexican revolutionaries like Claire de la Rocha. I think it creates a broader world that more people are able to appreciate when they draw upon influences from other cultures. And I recognize that there can be, like, problems with it. Like, it can present like you're using something in the wrong way. But I also think that it opens the world for more people to, like, love and connect to it, which is really important.
People who are like
of that
against
culture.
it are like, their point is that none of the people who made and designed these costumes, none of the people that wore it, none of the people that made this movie were of that culture.
Yeah,
which
is
a questionable.
That's a very fair criticism, and I think that Star Wars and, like, other franchises have sort of changed that in more recent years. They've sort of tried to remedy that, which is nice.
Well, and I think it's really interesting too to note that, like, you were saying that they pulled from the past and they pull from different, like, they have to have inspiration in order to create these futuristic costumes. And you see this in multiple sci-fi movies where they're pulling from not only different cultures but also different time periods, and they go to the past in order to design the future. Like, especially in Dune, the designers call it a mod evil, where it's a modern medieval design that they're pulling from, like, more Renaissance, even Baroque art that they're pulling from in order to make past costumes into future, which is an interesting fact with sci-fi.
It's something that audiences will be, like, vaguely familiar with, but, like, not, that it's not modern. So it's like,
so it's still distant.
It's distant enough.
So the Imperial Guards in The Return of the Jedi is a good example of that, I think, because they're clearly, like, neoclassical inspired, as Hollywood in history says, and Hollywood clothes of the future almost always reflect historic influences and can usually be placed into, like, different categories. They may be from other planets millions of years into the future, but the costumes in these films often reflect, like, the costumes of our past. And I think I think it's cool because it's like you have to have something to draw from, so we draw from our history. Yeah, so John Mallow was the costume designer for Star Wars for the first two Star Wars movies, I believe. And he was actually a military advisor on Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon, and he was very knowledgeable about military fashion. And so he used a lot of this to create a lot of the costumes, which is very obvious. A lot of the symbolism is very clearly from World War II as well as the Vietnam War, not just in style but plot-wise. And, like, World War II especially comes up again and again in sci-fi and in other genres.
I think something else significant about Star Wars that makes it so popular is its female characters. Obviously Princess Leia in the first one, but then also Padme and Jin and Rey. Their costumes are interesting, especially Padme's and Princess Leia's, because of how their costuming follows their storyline and how it develops through the movies. Leia, I guess, goes from a princess to, like, I think she's just a rebel fighter for the next two.
I think so. Well, I know she becomes a general in the later movies.
The latest sequels.
I think it's just really interesting in the first and second movies, particularly, like, she only really has one costume. And, like, that's what's kind of is like in the first and second films, is that it doesn't really range a lot. It's the iconic white dress that is mostly modest and high-necked and everything, and it's very kind of, it's a classic, but it's also kind of the opposite of what a lot of the other sci-fi movies are kind of portraying women as too, which I think is really interesting. Because I think it was interesting seeing women portrayed in the first movie, especially with that being the first one. Leia's really the only woman in the whole movie. And so it was interesting to see how they kept her costume like it was very neutral, very simple, and it was also due to the 70s style back then too, with that kind of free-flowing aspect. But
I think it really helps with the image of the film because she doesn't have all these really cool, beautiful costumes like Padme does. But when you think of Princess Leia, that's what you think of. And it like creates such a strong connection. Leia is a very different female character from Barbarella or like Uhura. She's still subject to the sexualization and male gaze, as well as Padme is in the prequel movies. Some of their costumes, specifically Leia's gold bikini. And then there's also Padme's black leather corset dress.
That is like the most sexual costume that she wears in the entire series, and it's the only one that George Lucas requested to design.
Patricia Bigar is the costume designer for Padme's dresses, and again, 68 of them. Very extensive wardrobe. They're really, really beautiful and elaborate.
So, as she goes from a queen to a senator, and as her relationship with Anakin develops, her costumes become more princessy almost. Like in the first movie, they're very big. You can see that it's like trying to assert her political power. It's like very elaborate. She's like giant headdresses. It's not
made for like movement. It's made to look at.
It's not like super romantic, but it is like impressive. And then in the second movie, she is wearing a lot more like romantic, flowy dresses, giving, like teenager almost.
Yeah, like I'm in college and I'm coming home.
It's not serious.
It's not serious.
I think
there's no somber tone.
She also wears her rebel jumpsuit, then it rips in half and it's like, oh.
Yeah, again, we keep going back to that. It's the thing that Feast came up with for Star Trek, where he's like, it's gonna fall off.
There is, I do know her picnic yellow dress, because I tried to make it. It has like so many layers in the skirts. It has this like yellow like silk, and then it has this yellow sheer sparkly fabric over it. But under those layers, it has colorful pastel layers of super, super thin fabric. I read an interview once where Natalie Portman was saying that they like had to carry her out into the fields and like place her there because it was so delicate. Like the fabric would rip, and in the scene she like runs through the fields and stuff. So I imagine that it it's like the pinnacle of like the romantic fun side of the relationship in the movie. In the third movie,
it's maternal. Like
it is maternal.
It is a very maternal nightgown. Like it's more of like shifty, like a shift dress almost. And aren't they more maxi too? Like they're more floor length.
She's back kind of in her formal, like she wears headdresses a lot.
Yeah, she's very sad the whole time.
And it's kind of like
she wears a lot of like blues. I feel like dark blues and purples.
Yeah.
Because I feel like blue is like a very somber, more delicate kind of color compared to the yellows and more dominant, fiery ones that she was wearing in the beginning.
I mean, it is just sort of like literally reflecting her emotional state. At her funeral, she's wearing this dark purple blue dress.
Yeah. It reminds me of like Ophelia. It looks like a lake of water.
Yeah, it looks like water.
Like she's like in a lake of water. Like she's drowning in there. With Padme's costumes, I think you can see a lot of that like influence from like world cultures that we were talking about. She has, I think in the first movie, her handmaidens are in this like long costume that kind of looks like a kimono. Obviously, like her face paint is very just reminiscent of like Asian culture.
Yeah, there's a lot of Eastern
dresses, and compare them to like various Asian cultures and like indigenous cultures, Russian too. She has two costumes where her hair is African, and then they put her in like box braids, but I don't think that scene showed up in the movie. And the one she wears at the end of the first movie, which again, I can see why people have a problem with it.
So I think her wedding dress, may have actually been made of like vintage like lace. Yeah, like it's like flapper Edwardian inspired. Yeah, she pushes like sort of the boundaries of fashion by like drawing from just so many cultures and just sort of making something completely new, which You know, it's sort of just that, like, if you're gonna make stuff for like the future and whatnot, how are you gonna do it?
The presentation of Leia and Padme changed dramatically with the movie's plots. Leia begins the original trilogy as a diplomatic figure in a loose, floor-length white gown with her hair tightly arranged. As the films progress, she is increasingly presented with respect to Han Solo rather in relation to her political role. A similar progression plays out for Padme as she goes from being a conservatively dressed leader to being defined in the context of Anakin Skywalker. And then I think Rey's interesting because she is in like the same costume for almost the whole entire series.
Yeah.
And there's also Gwendolyn Christie, who plays a stormtrooper. Phasma, yeah. And like, there's no sexualization there. I think that her costume was really great. And then Leia is back as General Organa, and she's kind of is like back in this like powerful position, while still being like that iconic Princess Leia. She still like has her hairstyles, but she's like in like utility clothes and obviously serves like a powerful position in the movie. I do want to say that I just love like all the general like alien design in the first Star Wars movie. It won an Academy Award.
In Barbarella, we're on an alien planet. They're all humans. Like, they're all people. In Star Trek, they do the same thing. But I think it's interesting that Star Wars does have more different creatures. They're not humanoid, and I really like that.
Yeah.
A word of warning. Alien.
2 years after John Lolo designed for A New Hope, he was a part of the costume design for Alien. You can see his love of European and American like military uniforms in that movie as well. As you're watching the movie, the captain, Dallas, you're kind of like, this is our main character, this is our hero of the story, but he dies like halfway through, and instead Ripley becomes like the main protagonist, and we are mainly following her story throughout the rest of the film. The costume design in this is definitely a departure from the earlier sci-fi films that were like pristine, clean, like white spaces, like retrofuturism and like Barbarella and like Star Trek, even Star Wars. I know like not all of it is like that,
but like they're shiny. Like Darth Vader's
like
shiny.
Darth Vader's, like... And so it's kind of more like gritty and industrial. This film takes place on the ship that is owned by a corporation called the Weyland-Yutani Corporation, and so they created this like stamp, and like they labeled everything with the corporation's logo and name. The costumes that the cast members themselves are wearing, they like sandpapered them so that they look like worn in, with the exception of Ash, whose character, spoilers, is an android. And all of their costumes are very customized to the individual character. Lambert, she's their navigator, so she has cowboy boots on, headbands, baseball caps, bomber jackets, Hawaiian shirts.
Most of them are wearing Converse.
And that's one of the first things I noticed about the costume, because it's not very futuristic. They seem like mechanics. Read someone compare them to truck drivers in like space. I was like, that's kind of perfect.
In a lot of military movies too, like you'll even have like they all have to have a certain uniform, but the way they style it like really brings out their character. And they're just like the ragtag crew that's behind being able to stop whatever bad is coming their way.
When they were pitching the movie, it was written, like the original concept was written like before the 1969 moon landing, and so people weren't like really into space as much as they were after. And I read someone pitch it as Jaws, but in space, and I think that's so awesome because it did remind me of Jaws, but in space.
Yeah.
The writer for the original story, Dan O'Bannon, his original characters in the story were kind of gender neutral, so it wasn't really focused on like if they were a man or a woman as much as it was focused on the alien. And so when it was adapted to screen, someone brought up like, why not cast a woman as Ripley? A lot of the time you'll hear people say that Ripley was originally written as a man. I don't know how true that was as much as it was like her character is gender neutral.
Yeah, I've heard that it was like they just didn't write with gender
Yeah.
in mind, and it just became what it did.
She and all of the cast wear these like gender neutral clothes throughout the whole film. It's not like sexual in nature, as like Barbarella.
Yeah, it's not intentionally like.
Yeah.
It's just clothes.
It does remind me of like Princess Leia's like snow jumpsuit kind of, except this one is even more practical.
Yeah, they're not going for like style. I mean, they look very stylish, but they're going for practicality.
Yeah, which is kind of the opposite of what the space age movement was, because it was more for the looks rather than for the convention.
Like the Converse, like you said. Like the jumpsuit, specifically Ripley's jumpsuit, is just an American Air Force jumpsuit that has like lacing details on it. So it's not only just like it's a very familiar costume for audiences, it's like accessible. As opposed to like Barbarella and even parts of Star Wars and Star Trek, I would argue that Ripley in Alien is like almost completely devoid of the male gaze. It's not that her character's not a woman, it's just that she's not like put into...
She's not meant for men to look at sexually. She's just a character,
which makes sense
like the men.
because she's like a crew member on this ship, so it just works for the story better than it does for the visuals of the male gaze. And it's an interesting discussion about like gender as a performance.
No, because part of what makes Ripley special is that she was not created to... She just is.
Yeah,
she was not created to be empowering. Yeah. She simply exists as something that becomes empowering.
Gender is the repeated stylization of the body, a set of repeated acts within a highly rigid regulatory frame that congeal over time to produce the appearance of substance of a natural sort of being. Because sci-fi and action and horror were such like a male-dominated genre for so long, it definitely is significant to put this female hero, this final girl, and one who's not like extremely feminine as your hero. When the movie came out, Sigourney Weaver was on the cover of Time magazine. Okay, uncertain of how to read the character, the cover of Time magazine featured an out-of-character Weaver in traditionally feminine makeup, while the article referred to her as Rambette. She kind of provides this like different character in sci-fi for women to like look at, especially if they have not been fans of like previous women in sci-fi, like Princess Leia or Barbarella.
Kind of less of like a damsel and like more of like, yeah, I can figure this problem out. Like, this is going to be a problem-solving character.
She is a very active character in the movie. Like, she is the one who defeats the alien. She, like, outlives everybody. Like, as opposed to Barbarella, who's constantly getting knocked out. No shade, Barbarella, but, like, Ripley, like, lives and survives, and she fights the whole time, and she, you know, doesn't die. One of the most significant parts of the movie in relation to her gender is one of the final scenes where she has seemingly escaped the alien, and she takes off her clothes down to like a tank top and underwear, and then she finds out that the alien is still on the ship.
Because it's just such a different scene for her character.
There are a lot of different opinions, and you could argue either way that either it is objectifying her or it's just treating her as it would a normal, like any other character. You could think about how all of the characters were originally like gender neutral. Sigourney Weaver said this herself about that scene. As for my strip, people have said, how could you demean yourself by doing a striptease? And I say, are you kidding? After 5 days of blood and guts and fear and sweat and urine, do you think Ripley wouldn't take off her clothes?
I mean,
she originally was rooting to be completely naked. So, like...
I don't think that the character was created for the male gaze. I don't even really think that they, like, intended that, but because she exists on screen as a woman, created by men, I think that she's just sort of subject to the male gaze, men watching the movie.
No, like, you can see Princess Leia in her floor-length dress, and that is also the male gaze. You can put any woman on screen and say that she escape the male gaze?
No, that's my point. That's my point.
I don't think it is with the intention of the male gaze.
I don't think so either.
Mm-hmm. I think I can see both sides too, where it's like, I don't even know if there are sides in this aspect, just because I think it is like, with what Sigourney was saying, like, that blood, guts, and everything, of course you're gonna want to strip down to that and be able to just be like, she's in a tank top and you can tell she doesn't have anything on, but it's also like something where it is something you would wear under a jumpsuit, where it's more for comfortability and convention in that way. But the way that it is kind of like looking at the stance she is in, it cannot escape the male gaze in that sense, where it's like maybe it wasn't the intention for that, but like I can definitely see how this would be seen as a sexy kind of wow, like she's showing a lot of skin where she wasn't before.
No. I just think ultimately it's like it's a practical choice in the plot of the movie for her to take her clothes off after she's been through this, and it also is like a symbolic choice, as her like removing the symbol of this corporation and like these white clothes under this symbol that she wants to escape.
Yeah, I think that's where it's also like I don't think we'll ever know exactly on what anybody really gets from it, or because there's just going to be so many different opinions and facts around it.
Like, ultimately, my decision on it comes from the fact that I think that if it were one of the male crew members who had survived instead of her, I think this scene would have been exactly the same.
I think that both points are very, very important into coming into why this scene in particular probably has been written about and has so many opinions circulating it too, is because it then again like what it like if they weren't intending it as the audience, like do we read too much into it or do we read too much out of it? And that's where you kind of get like that kind of conversation of what does it truly mean and does it need to mean anything, especially kind of going back with the gender, like does it need to matter that she needs to be an empowered woman, or can she just be as it is?
And also it's
but regardless,
she's not the only woman on the crew.
No, but
and
regardless, she's still a woman. Like,
in the movie, not really. It's not important.
She is to viewers. Clearly, because there was controversy about it. Like, it's just as important what the viewer is interpreting as what the creator is intending.
It's time.
The movie Dune. They're based in the desert, and so it's very more neutral-based tones in their costuming. But when you get into more of like what Lady Jessica wears, she's wearing beautiful colors that kind of astonish that she is higher in status and everything. It's kind of interesting because I mentioned it earlier, but Jacqueline West, who collaborated with Robert Morgan on Dune, said that they made it medieval, where it's a modern medieval kind of correlation, where I think it honestly can correlate to how sci-fi is made today. So I think it's also very interesting where it's like the medieval is very much like in all of the sci-fi movies that we're seeing is that they're pulling from the past and bringing it into today. And so, but that they're taking strong lines and strong color and strong more elements of the design that can attribute to an aesthetic piece and more conventional rather than stylistic. And so I just think it's really interesting that way too. Before, it was also in 1984 by David Lynch. And so even in that movie as well, like the colors are a lot more poppy in the 80s and than they would be in actually this movie. It's very different, and so it's interesting to see that they're ditching a lot of the more colorful of the 60s, 70s, and 80s and going more into neutral colors. There's the Abaddon, so it's called the Spacing Guild in Dune, and she actually, Jacqueline said that they wear more robes and more monk type of things, and it's a correlation to the Abaddon papacy in the 1200s, who ganged up against the Templars.
Yeah, it takes a lot of its aesthetics from like Islamic culture, like Islamic ideas, which I know some people have had some problems with, which again is totally fair. It's just very interesting to me what cultures people choose to draw from to be like, this is sci-fi, this is the future. And
sci-fi always trickles between the past and then the future. It never is kind of in the present unless it is along these lines. But it was interesting because the military style that takes place in Dune was also inspired by the Romanovs and how Dune was actually inspired not only by the Middle Eastern cultures, but also Russian. And so they pulled in from the Romanov story because it was a monarchy that was taken down and was honestly that's what the whole idea was behind it. And so a lot for the males characters, they were given a lot of the same imperialistic, very elegant kind of look in their uniforms that the Romanovs had. So the still suit it protects the wearer from heat, and it cools them and recycles moisture from their body so that they can drink it, and then it continues. But it was interesting to hear the designers talk about it because they were like, we had to create a costume like this suit that would fit everybody. And so you have Jason Momoa, who is a ginormous man, and then to Zendaya, to Rebecca Ferguson, Timothy Chalamet, and then also like a lot of other actors. And so they were saying that when they put on the still suit, it was interesting to see how the actors themselves would come into that character. They made a suit that could fit every body type, and also it was a gender fluid suit because it was more made for survival, the idea of survival, rather than for fashion and function. Lady Jessica, she has a lot of different, she goes from wearing very stylistic veils that insert her status and her chainmail as well as what was brought in. And so you can just see throughout the movie that she gets more into the still suit and living with the Fremens, because the Fremens are the people that are the natives to the planet Arrakis. Some fashion icons outside of the film they'll create or find pieces that will relate to the movie, especially in Dune. And it's just really interesting to see how the things that are created in sci-fi, especially regarding more of the female kind of costuming, is seen in modern fashion, especially in more couture.
I did really like the Thierry Mugler 1995 outfit that she wore, because it's not like specifically Dune to me, but it is very sci-fi, because Dune doesn't really look like that. Like this honestly looks more like Barbarella than Dune. But I just think it's interesting, her little red carpet homage to Dune, and also wider sci-fi fashion.
And just seeing the sci-fi fashion grow in that sense, and how it really is more of an art form rather than a conventional fashion.
So I guess my biggest takeaway was just like how the depiction of women in like such a male-dominated genre has shifted over time, from Barbarella to Star Trek to Princess Leia to Ripley to Blade Runner to more Star Wars. Just like how that like independence and just like depiction of women has generally changed over time.
The most interesting thing to me is sort of how the idea of the future, or like sci-fi as a genre, develops throughout time. So like in Barbarella, it's how it's like very shiny and sexy and very similar to Star Trek in that. And then for like Star Wars and Alien and even Blade Runner, it has this like grungier like look to it, and just how that sort of reflects the ideas of the time, and how the people who are making the movies are thinking about the future and, you know, space and whatnot.
I guess where watching these sci-fi films, it was really interesting because I think from the first glance, before I would have done any research or watching the films, I would have seen these. I definitely saw the women as more independent and go-getters necessarily, where they didn't really need anybody. And especially like with Barbarella and stuff, it's been interesting to see the side of how they might be sexualized in some ways, but also it's really interesting to note that for the time period, it was a very progressive mindset that sci-fi took, and while it was mainly a male-dominated like audience, I think some women found some power in that as well. And like given for some films and stuff, like there are definitely some things where you're like, wow, like the woman is definitely not represented very well here, and it's mainly for aesthetics for the man. But I think it also just proves that in comparison to what the 50s and the 40s were, it kind of took a huge step. And also the designing process for designing futuristic things, we look into the past, and I think that's like a huge thing. And seeing how sci-fi has brought a new world of fashion, of not only in film but also into the world as well. And I think that's a really interesting.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyways, thanks for watching.
That's all.